In the history of organized crime, some empires fall with the roar of war, and others simply vanish as if they never existed. In the early 21st century, Australia was the undisputed domain of one such power. They didn't operate from boardrooms or tax havens. Their power was measured in decibels and kilometers of occupied asphalt. They were the rebels, the country's largest outlaw motorcycle club. In their prime, to see them arrive was to witness a force of nature. In 2013 in Perth, nearly 1,000 members from across the country gathered for their annual national run. A show of force that required the largest police operation since a visit from the Queen. They were an army of leather and chrome, a visible, loud, and defiant brotherhood whose power was openly displayed on the streets of Australian cities. Their insignia, the Confederate flag with a skull and the 1% patch, was an unmistakable symbol of their territorial dominance. And then, silence. The roar faded. The empire shrank. There was no final massacre like the Milpera incident in 1984 to redefine the landscape. There was no declared war that culminated in a winner and a loser. The rebels, who at their zenith had over 70 chapters and more than 1,000 members, becoming one of the country's greatest criminal threats, simply lost their crown. How is it possible that such a vast organization, forged in decades of violent turf wars against rivals like the Bandidos or Rock Machine, was displaced not with a bang, but with a whisper? This is the central question that forces us to look beyond the chronicles of gang warfare. The answer is not found on the traditional underworld battlefield, but at the intersection of criminology, technology, and globalization. This documentary proposes a bold thesis. The fall of the rebels was not simply the defeat of a biker club, it was an extinction event. It was the disappearance of a criminal model. The rebels, dinosaurs of an analog world based on brute force, tribal loyalty, and above all, visibility, were annihilated by a new type of predator. A globalized, stealthy, and corporate criminal syndicate that understood that in the 21st century, true power isn't flaunted on the street, it's managed in the shadows. This new player, the Albanian Mafia, didn't come to conquer territory. They came to capture the market. And they did so with the silent efficiency of a multinational corporation, rendering the rebels' model obsolete, inefficient, and fatally vulnerable overnight. This is the story of how a continent is lost, not in a war, but in a paradigm shift. To understand the extinction, we must first understand the species. The Outlaw Motorcycle Club, or OMCG, was not born as a crime syndicate, but as a subculture. In the Australia of the 1950s and 60s, a society still recovering from the scars of war, the motorcycle was a vehicle for those who couldn't afford a car and a symbol for those who didn't fit in. From this breeding ground of alienation and pride in otherness, biker tribalism was born. Australia's first outlaw club, the Gladiators, was formed in 1960, but it was in 1969, in Brisbane, Queensland, that a man named Clint Jacks founded a club that would come to define the country's criminal landscape, the Confederates, soon to be known as the Rebels. Their criminal business model was a direct reflection of their culture: territorial control through intimidation, extortion, local drug and arms trafficking, and spectacular public violence to keep rivals at bay. Their power resided in their visible symbols: the leather vests with their colors, the fortified clubhouses that marked their territory in cities from Albion to Rockhampton, and the massive processions of Harley-Davidsons that brought traffic to a standstill. They were a fraternity built on the rejection of conventional society, and their structure, though hierarchical and military-inspired, was based on personal loyalty and a shared outlaw identity. This culture of visibility was both their greatest strength and their Achilles heel. It created an intimidating brand and fostered cohesion. But it also provided law enforcement with a detailed map of their organization, making their members and clubhouses easy targets for raids and new legislation like anti-association laws. For over 40 years, this vast and often chaotic empire was ruled by a figure who seemed torn from a crime epic: Alessio Alex Vella, the Maltese Falcon. His personal story is the embodiment of the leadership model the rebels represented. Born in Malta in 1953 into a strict Catholic family of 11 children, Vella arrived in Australia in the 60s, barely able to read or write. He worked as a bricklayer, a bouncer, and on strawberry farms, personifying the immigrant struggle. But Vella had two exceptional talents: the controlled violence of the boxing ring, where he became Malta's light heavyweight champion, and the uncontrolled violence of the street. He joined the rebels in 1972 and rose to national president in 1973, a position he would hold for 4 decades. Vella was the philosopher king of the biker world, charismatic, brutal when necessary, but also astute. He used $225,000 in compensation from a motorcycle accident to start a motorcycle import business, laying the foundation for a considerable financial empire that included an extensive property portfolio and one of Australia's finest collections of Harley-Davidsons. Despite constant investigations and massive raids, such as the one in 1995 in which $3 million in assets were seized, which he later had to recover in court, the police struggled for decades to imprison him on major charges. His leadership was absolute and personal. He was the glue that held dozens of often feuding factions together. His word was law. This centralization of power in a single charismatic figure made the club incredibly strong under his rule, but also fatally fragile. The Australian authorities, unable to jail him, found his one vulnerability. Despite living in Australia for 46 years, Alex Vella had never become an Australian citizen. While Alex Vella was consolidating his asphalt empire in Australia, thousands of kilometers away in the Balkans, history was forging a completely different kind of criminal. The collapse of communism in Albania in the 1990s plunged the country into chaos. The fall of the state, endemic corruption, and the collapse of massive pyramid schemes that ruined 2/3 of the population created the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of a new model of organized crime, the Mafia Shqiptare. Unlike the rebels, their structure was not based on a subculture or loyalty to a vest. Its core was the FIS, the family clan, an impenetrable social unit bound by blood and an ancient code of honor known as Besa, which means trust or to keep the promise. This structure gave them a secrecy and internal discipline that made them virtually immune to police infiltration. Their business model was not local extortion, but global logistics. They learned to operate in an environment of failed states, where borders are porous and institutions are corruptible. They applied this lesson on a global scale. In the cocaine market, they staged a corporate revolution. Instead of dealing with intermediaries in Europe, they went directly to the source, the Colombian cartels. This move, a classic vertical integration strategy, allowed them to acquire cocaine at drastically lower prices, between $4,000 and $5,500 per kilo, while their rivals paid Dutch wholesalers up to $22,500. The result was a total market disruption. They offered a higher purity product at a lower price. An unbeatable value proposition. To secure their supply chains, they forged strategic alliances with the world's most powerful mafias, like the Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta, which gave them access to and control over major European ports. They weren't a gang. They were a transnational crime corporation. Their modus operandi was stealth. They used professional facilitators, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and infiltrated legitimate businesses to launder their profits and conceal their operations. Their power did not lie in public intimidation, but in invisible efficiency. They were the architects of a new criminal paradigm, one for which the rebels were utterly unprepared. In the late 2000s, the rebels, at the height of their power, became embroiled in a conflict that perfectly defined their worldview. The arrival of a chapter of the Canadian club rock machine in Perth was seen as a direct affront, a territorial invasion to be repelled with maximum violence. What followed was a textbook war, an old-school conflict fought in plain sight. Police chronicles from the era read like an action movie script, brutal mass brawls at nightclubs, and mixed martial arts events, cars and tattoo parlors, like the rebels-owned Ink Assault, consumed by the flames of Molotov cocktails in the middle of the night, and a broad daylight assassination attempt on the rebels' West Australian president, Nick Martin, who was shot outside his home in March 2011. The rebels' response was equally spectacular. Processions of 15 members in full colors parading through Fremantle's entertainment districts in a clear provocation. The war was so public and so violent that it prompted an unprecedented police response, culminating in special forces using an armored vehicle to ram down the door of the rebels' clubhouse in Osborne Park. For the rebels, this was how power was measured: a public display of force, the violent defense of territory. However, from a strategic perspective, this war was a catastrophic mistake. While the club invested enormous resources, the attention of its leaders, and the lives of its members in a loud and bloody dispute for control of Perth's streets, they were completely blind to the real threat. The war with Rock Machine made them feel powerful, reaffirming their identity as street warriors, but it was actually a deadly distraction. They were fighting for street corners while, silently, the Albanian syndicates were seizing control of international supply routes, and with them, the true source of their economic power. At the same time, the club was bleeding from external wars. A silent disease was consuming its structure from within. The culture of brotherhood, the pillar upon which the club was built, was crumbling. A report from the Australian Institute of Criminology identified a profound generational shift: the emergence of the Nike Bickies. This was a new wave of younger members, often recruited directly from prisons, who were drawn not by a love for motorcycles or the ideal of outlaw freedom, but by status and, above all, the opportunities for illicit profit. Journalist and former Mongols member Mahmoud Fazal described this new mentality as a fascination with get-rich-quick fantasies over genuine community. Loyalty ceased to be an absolute value and became transactional. The club transformed into a platform for personal gain, a pyramid scheme where money flowed upward, exploiting lower-ranking members. This cultural decay had devastating consequences. Internal cohesion evaporated, giving way to disputes over money and power. The ultimate proof of this implosion came in 2024, when 36 members from the Western Australian chapters, led by 25-year veteran Carl Labrook, handed in their colours in a mass resignation. The official reason was a lack of support from the national leadership, headed by Damien Vella, during their recent war with the Mongols, and a dispute over Labrook's integrity. The result was unthinkable a decade earlier. Labrook and other high-profile members defected to join their longtime rivals, the Comancheros. The rebels' brand could no longer guarantee loyalty. The organization had become fragile, prone to schisms and betrayal. If internal decay was a chronic illness, the killing blow came from the outside, and it wasn't an attack from a rival, but an administrative decision. In June 2014, while Alex Vella was visiting his native Malta, the Australian government, under then Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, cancelled his residency visa on character grounds. With a simple bureaucratic act, Vella was stranded overseas, permanently exiled from the country that had been his home for nearly half a century, and from the criminal empire he had led for 40 years. It was a surgical decapitation strike. The authorities had understood that the rebels' strength lay not in their numbers, but in the singular, charismatic authority of their leader. His expulsion created an instant and catastrophic power vacuum. Police sources claimed the club never recovered from his absence. Leadership fell to his nephew, Damien Vella, but his tenure was plagued by instability and internal dissent, as the rebellion in Western Australia demonstrated. The absence of the Maltese Falcon sent ripples of instability throughout the organization, with longtime members feeling abandoned and handing in their patches at an unprecedented rate. The government didn't need a war. It simply removed the club's center of gravity, and the structure, deprived of its organizing principle, began to collapse in on itself. While the rebels were fighting their ghosts, both internal and external, the new predator was moving with a completely different logic. They didn't seek direct confrontation. Their strategy was the silent infiltration of the systems that underpin society. Investigations by the Australian Federal Police, AFP, revealed their modus operandi. Albanian syndicates used professional facilitators, like a Melbourne real estate agent, to identify rental properties whose owners lived overseas, thus ensuring there would be no surprise inspections. These anonymous houses in quiet suburbs were converted into a decentralized and undetectable network of cannabis grow houses. They didn't need a fortified, visible clubhouse that would attract police attention. Their infrastructure was invisible, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Intelligence gathered in Operation Ironside connected the leaders of these local cells directly with known international Albanian organized crime identities. Their approach was businesslike, diversified, transnational, and focused on efficiency and low risk. They didn't take territory by force. They acquired it through corruption and the exploitation of loopholes in the legitimate system. The final blow, however, would not be a bullet or a bomb, but a product of the digital age. The criminal world, including OMCGs, had become dangerously dependent on technology to shield itself from the modern surveillance state. Face-to-face communication in clubhouses was replaced by encrypted messages, the key to secure, large-scale operations. In this market of digital paranoia, a new platform emerged, an app called AN0M, installed on modified mobile phones. It spread like wildfire through the global underworld, endorsed by high-profile criminal influencers who vouched for its invulnerability. For the remnants of an analog empire like the rebels, and for the new corporate mafias alike, AN0M seemed to be the ultimate tool, the key to invisibility and impunity. They believed they had found a ghost in the machine that would make them untouchable. They could not have been more wrong. What they didn't know was that the ghost was, in fact, the state itself. The AN0M app was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. A vast and sophisticated honeypot operation designed and controlled by the FBI and the Australian Federal Police. Every message, every plan, every confession sent through the network they believed was secure was being read in real time by their greatest enemies. The very instrument they adopted to survive in the new world would become the weapon of their annihilation. While the rebels were crumbling from within, eaten away by disloyalty, and decapitated by a bureaucratic decision, Australian and American law enforcement agencies were not just watching. They were building a weapon of unprecedented sophistication and audacity. The genesis of this weapon lies in the digital power vacuum created in 2018. In a coordinated operation, the FBI dismantled Phantom Secure, one of the most popular encrypted communication platforms in the global underworld. Its CEO was arrested, its servers seized. For organized crime, it was a cataclysm. Overnight, thousands of high-level criminals fell silent, desperately searching for a new, secure channel to communicate. It was in this panic-driven market that the FBI and the Australian Federal Police, AFP, saw a historic opportunity. This wasn't about hacking the enemy. It was about becoming their service provider. The fall of Phantom Secure created a gold rush. Everyone was looking for the next unbreakable system. The question the FBI and AFP asked was, what if instead of trying to crack the next safe, we just build it ourselves and give them the key? The plan was diabolically simple. The FBI located and persuaded a confidential informant, a developer who had worked for Phantom Secure and was now facing criminal charges. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he was given a task: create a new encryption platform from scratch. It wouldn't be a hacked system. It would be a bespoke surveillance tool, a digital Trojan horse disguised as a fortress. They called it Anon. Technologically, it was a masterpiece of deception. The devices were Android smartphones, primarily Google Pixels, modified with a custom operating system called Arcane OS. This system stripped away all normal functions: no voice calls, no email, no location services. To add to its mystique, the messaging app was hidden behind a calculator app. The user had to enter a specific code into the calculator to access the secret chat, a touch of what one expert described as pretty amusing security theater. But the real genius lay at its core. FBI and AFP engineers had embedded a master key into the encryption system itself. Every time a criminal sent a message, the system created a hidden copy, a blind carbon copy, which was diverted to a secret, law enforcement-controlled server nicknamed iBot. There, the message was decrypted, copied, and stored. The shield the criminals believed was impenetrable was, in reality, a one-way mirror. And the testing ground for this global trap would be Australia. The informant offered the first 50 ANOM devices to 3 former Phantom Secure distributors with deep connections in the Australian underworld. The AFP, armed with a court order, began to monitor. The result exceeded all expectations. Every single one of the 50 devices was used for criminal activity, allowing police to penetrate 2 of the country's most sophisticated criminal networks. The beta test was a resounding success. The trap was ready to be deployed on a global scale. The growth of ANOM wasn't based on advertising, but on the oldest principle of the underworld, trust. To get a device, you had to know a criminal. This exclusivity, coupled with a subscription price of $1,500 to $2,000 for 6 months, made it a status symbol, a tool for the criminal elite. But for a virus to spread, it needs an influential patient zero, and law enforcement found the perfect carrier. His name was Hakan Ayik, a high-profile Australian drug trafficker, fugitive, and associate of the Comanchero motorcycle club. Ayik was a figure of immense respect and trust in the international underworld. Undercover agents, unbeknownst to him, encouraged him to adopt and distribute the ANOM devices. His endorsement was the ultimate seal of approval. Without knowing it, one of Australia's most wanted men became the lead salesman for an FBI front company. The tipping point came in March 2021. European police dismantled another major encrypted platform, Sky ECC. Panic gripped the underworld. In a mass migration, thousands of criminals desperate for a safe haven flocked to ANOM, the one platform their most trusted contacts, like Hakan Ayik, had guaranteed was unbreachable. The user base exploded. Soon, over 12,000 ANOM devices were active in more than 100 countries, used by over 300 criminal syndicates. Their clients included the Italian Mafia, Albanian organized crime, and fatally for our story, the outlaw motorcycle gangs, including the last vestiges of the rebels' empire. Both the analog dinosaur and the new corporate predator were now drinking from the same poisoned well. For the next 18 months, law enforcement had a front-row seat to the inner workings of global organized crime. At an FBI operations center in San Diego, a team of agents and linguists worked around the clock, cataloging and analyzing a torrent of more than 27 million messages in real time. It was a window into a world that had always operated in darkness, and what they saw was chilling, not just for its criminality, but for the arrogance and blind trust of its perpetrators. Believing their communications were absolutely secret, the criminals spoke with brutal frankness. They planned multi-ton drug importations, sharing photos of cocaine hidden in shipments of pineapples, bananas, and tuna cans. They coordinated global money laundering networks and discussed the corruption of port officials. And they planned murders. In Australia, the AFP intercepted at least 20 ongoing murder plots, intervening at the last moment to save lives. This global operation was made possible by a complex web of international cooperation. To avoid legal issues in the United States, the servers collecting the messages were located in a third country, later revealed to be Lithuania. Through a mutual legal assistance treaty, this country legally passed the data to the FBI, which in turn shared it with a coalition of 16 nations, including the AFP in Australia and Europol in Europe. It was an unprecedented alliance against a global enemy. For 3 years, the global underworld entrusted its fate to a machine they believed was their salvation. They didn't know that every word, every plan, every secret was being archived, analyzed, and turned into the weapon of their own destruction. The clock was ticking towards Judgment Day, June 8th, 2021. As the world awoke, the largest coordinated police operation in history was about to be unleashed. The date was not chosen at random. A key surveillance warrant was about to expire, forcing law enforcement's hand. In 16 countries, thousands of officers awaited the same signal. In Australia, the operation had a name: Ironside. At dawn, the storm broke. More than 4,000 officers from the federal police and state police forces fanned out across every mainland state in Australia. Hundreds of search warrants were executed simultaneously. The doors of bikkie clubhouses, suburban homes, and luxury businesses were smashed in by heavily armed tactical teams. For the criminals, the shock was total. For 3 years, they had operated with a sense of divine invulnerability, protected by what they believed was the most secure technology on the planet. In that instant, as officers confiscated their Anom phones, the devastating truth hit them. Their fortress was a prison. Their most intimate confidant had been their greatest betrayer. It wasn't just an arrest. It was the collapse of their reality. When the dust settled, the scale of the sting became clear. The numbers were on a scale that seemed torn from fiction. In Australia alone, Operation Ironside was a devastating blow to organized crime. The initial figures from June 2021 were already impressive, but they paled in comparison over time. The initial 224 arrests grew to 392 by June 2024. The 526 charges filed skyrocketed to over 2,355. The 3.7 tons of drugs seized nearly doubled to over 6.6 tons. The cash confiscated leaped from nearly $45 million to over $55.6 million. And the 104 firearms taken off the streets increased to 149. And this was just one part of the global offensive. Worldwide, Operation Trojan Shield dismantled entire networks. More than 800 high-level criminals were arrested. Over 53 tons of drugs were seized, including 8 tons of cocaine and 22 tons of cannabis. More than $48 million in cash and cryptocurrencies were confiscated, along with 250 firearms and dozens of luxury vehicles. Statements from police leaders around the world reflected the unprecedented nature of the operation. Europol called it the biggest ever law enforcement operation against encrypted communication. But it was the acting U.S. attorney, Randy Grossman, who captured the essence of the operation in one damning sentence. The blow wasn't just material, it was psychological. Operation Ironside didn't just seize drugs and money, it destroyed trust. It shattered faith in the entire encrypted communication industry, a foundational pillar of modern organized crime. The seed of paranoia had been planted. From that day forward, any criminal using a secure device would have to wonder if the FBI itself wasn't listening on the other end of the line. To combat a global criminal corporation, law enforcement had become a disruptive tech startup. They identified a gap in the market, developed a superior product, marketed it through influencers, and, in a coordinated exit, liquidated their entire customer base. It was a paradigm shift, not just for crime, but for policing itself. Among the hundreds arrested in Operation Ironside were members of virtually every major criminal syndicate in Australia: the Italian Mafia, Asian syndicates, Albanian networks, and of course, the outlaw motorcycle gangs. For the rebels, already weakened and rudderless, it was the final blow. The arrests of key members deepened the power vacuum created by Alex Vela's expulsion, a void his nephew Damien Vela could never fill. The already fragile structure shattered. The final, most pathetic symptom of this terminal decline occurred far from the police raids in Western Australia. There, the local chapter, which had felt abandoned by the national leadership during its bloody war with the rival Mongols, reached its breaking point. The respected WA boss, Carl Labrook, a 25-year veteran of the club, had a bitter dispute with Damien Vela over matters of money and honor. Labrook's response was unthinkable a decade earlier. He, along with 36 members, handed in their colors in a mass resignation. But they didn't just leave. In a final act of betrayal that pulverized the biker code, Lebruck and other high-profile members defected to join their lifelong arch-enemies, the Comancheros. Elsewhere in the country, like Canberra, entire rebels chapters simply dissolved, their members patching over to the Finks. It wasn't a defeat, it was an evaporation. The name Rebels, the brand that once terrorized Australia's highways, was now worthless. Their colors, once a sacred symbol of brotherhood and territorial power, became a meaningless relic. Operation Ironside was a mass extinction event, but criminal life, like all life, finds a way to adapt. The Australian underworld landscape was reshaped forever. The more agile and corporate syndicates, like the Albanian groups, though also hit, learned a vital lesson about the dangers of technological dependence. Australian police now predict the next evolution will be for major syndicates to develop their own bespoke, encrypted communication devices and private networks, custom-built and beyond the reach of any future honeypot. The era when a single trap could catch everyone at once is likely over. The silent predator survived. The Albanian Mafia's model, decentralized, based on impenetrable family clans, and focused on the stealthy infiltration of the legitimate economy by using facilitators like real estate agents to set up networks of cannabis grow houses in anonymous suburban homes, proved to be inherently more resilient. Their power did not reside in a visible brand like the rebels, but in anonymity and efficiency. A visible brand had become not an asset, but a target. And so, the roar died. The fall of the rebels was not the chronicle of a gang war. It was the fossil record of an extinction. Their operating model, forged in an analog world of brute force, tribal loyalty, and intimidating visibility, was rendered obsolete by history. They were warriors of the leather and chrome era, fighting a digital war they never understood. Thousands of miles away in Malta, Alex Vela lives as the exiled king of an empire that no longer exists. His expulsion in 2014 was not just the removal of a leader, it was the removal of the center of gravity that held a chaotic universe together. Operation Ironside simply swept away the debris of a structure that was already hollow from within. The story of the rebels is a lesson in the changing nature of power. It demonstrates that in the 21st century, real power is not displayed on the streets with leather vests and shows of force. It is managed in the shadows, through encrypted networks and global supply chains. You don't conquer territory, you capture the market. The rebels didn't lose Australia in a battle. They lost it because the world changed around them, and they failed to notice. They were outmatched not by a stronger rival, but by a smarter paradigm. Their story is the ultimate chronicle of how an empire that once seemed invincible can simply vanish, not with a bang, but with the digital silence that follows a bygone era.